Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my analysis into Nietzsche's Will to Power, and specifically I'm going to address this notion of suffering. In the last section we talked about suffering and the representation of suffering through representatives, individuals who are themselves not suffering, but are representing the suffering of others for a number of reasons. And obviously Nietzsche looks at this in a pejorative sense, right? This is merely a vehicle of bloating the state. So we talked about how that happens and how the state gets bloated financially off of the sort of the stream, the influx of capital from the bottom up. What we're going to do in today's section, which is going to be section point 701, and it's not going to be very long, is to look at a hybrid account between both Nietzsche and Fourier. I've talked about the combination of Nietzsche and Jose Ortega y Gasset, right? So we talked about how Nietzsche and Gasset's concepts sort of relate. Now today we're going to talk about how Nietzsche's concepts relate to Paulo Freire. And for me, obviously, these are the texts that sort of define me as a theorist, right? Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Friedrich Nietzsche's Will to Power, and Jose Ortega y Gasset's The Revolt of the Masses, all of which I've done video lectures on, all of which I will eventually complete. I will eventually complete video lectures on all three of these books. Today specifically, as I said, in this section of the lecture, 7.0.1, I want to tidy up the last bit on the notion of suffering, and then I want to look at an assessment comparing and contrasting concepts within both Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Friedrich Nietzsche's Will to Power. With that, let's begin. Will to Power. And this is section point 7.0.1. And this is the banner of suffering. The banner of suffering. Okay, so let's get our books and let's get started. So we're on notes 80. Note 80. Okay, so what does Nietzsche say, right? He says, quote, and this is a direct quote from the text, "One is deceived every time one expects progress." And what we'll see as the book 1 part 2 concludes, as all of book 1 concludes, this notion of progress is going to be important. So we'll return to this idea of progress. Right now we don't have enough to sort of make sense of what Nietzsche is going to do with this notion of progress, but it's a very important concept. Again, quote, "One is deceived every time one expects progress from an ideal. Every time so far, the victory of the ideal has met a retrograde movement," right? Every time so far, rather than getting progress, what we've gotten is, and we've been met by this retrograde movement. And the question is, what are some examples of these movements, right? The movements, according to Nietzsche, again in note 80, Christianity, the revolution, the abolition of slavery, equal rights, philanthropy, love of peace, justice, and truth, right? These are some ideas of the movements that we can talk about. The question are, why are these movements considered retrograde? What is it about these movements that are considered retrograde? And here's what's the important point, and I want to spend just a little bit of time discussing this. We'll tidy that up, and then we'll move on. Why the movements are considered retrograde? They are showy words, right? They are showy words. This comes from Nietzsche himself. So if you look at the very last line of note 80 in Will to Power, it says, "But as showy words for something quite different, indeed opposite." he's looking at these movements as the ability to represent the suffering of individuals by their respective representatives as being nothing more than quote-unquote showy words, right? So from Nietzsche, and I do want to read just a little bit of the first part of note 80. He says, towards a critique of what? Big words, right? So the notion is of the relationship. We're trying to make sense of the relationship. B/ is between the movement, right? We want to make a relationship between the movement on the one hand and progress, right? Is it actual progress? Is it retrograde, as he says? The movement and progress. And there's many movements that we can be talking about. Toward a critique, this is right from the beginning of note 80. Toward a critique of the big words, I am full of suspicion and malice against what they call ideals. This is my pessimism. This is my pessimism, as Nietzsche is saying to himself, of himself. This is my pessimism, to have recognized how the higher feelings are a source of misfortune and man's loss of value, right? So that what ends up happening, and it's important, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but it's important to recognize that when we're talking about these showy words, right? When we talk about these showy words, or these big words, these big showy words, this is Nietzsche's language, right? When we're talking about big showy words, right? When we say value, when we say morality, when we say virtue, right? And so on, and meekness, and so on. When we use these big words, when we talk about suffering especially, right? When we talk about suffering, what we're saying is that, and this is very important, and it's actually very simple. When we're using these words, value, value is showy insofar as we are referring to value as this highest ideal, right? We haven't yet seen what value might be devoid of this highest ideal, but value as this highest ideal. And, I'm not going to beat and belabor the point, because Nietzsche's talked about this time and time again throughout the analysis, but we recognize that morality as this, oh, I am so moral, right? This big sort of ostentatious, this pretentious act, this show, right? Obviously, he says Christianity, the revolution, the abolition of slavery, equal rights, and so on, peace, love, harmony. I mean, all of sort of the cliche, sappy, if you will. And it would have been interesting to know Nietzsche as an individual. I'm not sure necessarily he and I would have gotten along. He had his own biases, but I can imagine his demeanor. It's like these big showy words. It's this very pretentious display of concern, right? When in fact all that these systems do is inhere standards of domination. Specifically when we're talking about the notion of suffering, and again, I'm not trying to belabor the point. This is really just to sort of tidy up the last bit that we discussed. Insofar as we're talking about representatives, we have people who are actually suffering, the sufferers, right? And the sufferers, the sufferers are represented by the sufferers are represented by representatives, right? The representatives represent the sufferers, and we talked about this before. What the representatives do is that they evoke these big showy words. Value, equality. What does he say? Value, equality, abolition of slavery, love, justice, truth. They represent the suffering, though themselves are not suffering, of the sufferers, using these big showy words to create this sense of egalitarianism, sort of social equality, and so on, right? And for Nietzsche, there can't really be anything worse than the attempt to posit this highest value, right? Deliberately, these representatives are deliberately positing these highest values and are themselves not members of the suffering class. They themselves aren't suffering. And the whole point is that this becomes a production, right? This becomes a show. So again, I'm not here to spend more time than need be on this point. I just wanted to incorporate that into the last bit. Okay.